Today's story is about the 45th Warframe, Lavos. Released on the 18th of December 2020 alongside his signature primary, the Cedo, during Operation Orphix Venom, Lavos is rich with lore and mythological intrigue. However, to understand Lavos and his story, we must first discuss the Orokin principle of transmutation. We may know transmutation here on Earth as the fable of alchemy or chrysopia, the belief that one can convert base metals, typically lead, into gold. The higher caste of Orokin society feared those who taught and practiced the art of transmutation, as Orokin society was governed by wealth and status. If a lower member of Orokin society could turn common rock into Orokin gold, then the entire system as they knew it could come unearthed, with many members of the lower caste potentially rising from their social anathema. The Orokin ruled that transmutation was a myth to the masses and an act of treasonous heresy to those who practiced. The Seven knew that the only way to keep Orokin society exactly as it was the red liquor of life, Kuva. Closely guarded and gatekept from the common folk, Kuva allowed those among the Orokin to continue their lifespans theoretically infinitely, whilst also preserving their place within the pre-existent social hierarchy. There was no single transmuter anywhere in the Origin system that was as terrifying to the Seven as the disgraced Archimedean Jarvi. In Orokin society, Archimedeans were some of the most respected members of the ruling caste. They took their name from the ancient Greek Archimedes, who was famed for his many endeavours with mathematics, engineering, astronomy, and the ilk. As such, Archimedeans were tasked with personally furthering Orokin culture through scientific discovery. Some of the most powerful of the Orokin elite and even executors themselves were formerly Archimedeans. Some familiar names dot their ranks: Executor Ballas with his knowledge of warframes and infestation, Albrecht Entrati with his studies into the void and the indifference, Margulis, the mother of transference. It was as surprising to anyone in the system that someone of such prestige found himself in the mountains of Venus at the prison fortress known as Duboth Kra. They say that no single transmuter anywhere in Orokin society was as feared as the former Archimedean Jarvi, master of alchemy, and as such his personally assigned warden was a powerful purpose-built warframe called Lavos. Now, Lavos was one of many custodians of many prisoners at Duboth Kra. However, he was well reputed for being one of the most cruel and even sadistic. Some of the prisoners would even play evil pranks on each other in the few common areas by pushing one of their peers directly into the path of Lavos, earning them a beating they'd almost certainly never walk off. Thus, Lavos was the perfect warden for a dangerous prisoner such as Jarvi. At this point in his life, Jarvi was actually a skeletally thin shadow of his former self. Still clad in his old Archimedean robes, a token of his former station, albeit now poorly fitting, covered in dirt and excrement. His forearms each bore a coiling snake tattoo stretching from elbow to hand. Some theorize these snakes to invoke Caduceus and Ouroboros, ancient symbols that have been closely related to alchemy and the pursuit of the materia prima in our own earthly history. Caduceus first appeared as far back as 4000 BC from Mesopotamian culture as the staff of the Sumerian god Ningin-Jida. The staff was then later adopted in the classical period by the Romans as the staff of Hermes or Mercury. It became the astrological symbol for the planet of the same name and represented the compound then known as quicksilver, a component most important to the field of alchemy and thus where we get our connection from Caduceus to transmutation. Similarly, Ouroboros, quite literally on the other hand, has strong ties to ancient Egyptian mythology and was famously carved into the wall surrounding the casket that held Tutankhamun, boy pharaoh of the ancient Egyptians. A snake devouring its own tail, detailing transmutation in its own way. Death through life, life through death. However, most famously, Ouroboros is closely associated with the legend of the ancient art of chrysopia and the creation of the Philosopher's Stone, a relic said to embody all the principles of alchemy, thus linking our second snake back to the legend of alchemy. Now then, back to the Orokin Empire of Warframe. Lavos, the subject of today's video, bears an intriguing conundrum. We're not quite sure who built him and for what purpose he was originally constructed. We know for sure that Ballas was the constructor and primary of many infinite castes of warframes, likewise Parvos Granum the constructor of Protea, and Albrecht Entrati the creator of at least both Corvex and Briscoe. However, Lavos was made differently. He was imbued with zero powers, and I personally theorize there are a few reasons a Warframe may not potentially be given powers. Maybe the Dax Warrior didn't resonate enough with the Technocyte virus to generate abilities. Maybe the creator just took them away to simply do his duties as a humble prison jailer. Now, some of you may be asking yourselves, If transmutation presented such a danger to the Orokin way of life and Jarvi was the most powerful, then why not execute him? Why keep him prisoner at all at Deboth Kra? The answer is staggeringly simple. For all of their grandiosity and narcissism, the Orokin were surprisingly gullible, superstitious people. There were rumours that the disgraced Archimedean was so competent in the alchemical arts that were he to be struck down by the Jade Light, he would likely come back potentially even stronger. Some compared him to that of the Hydra, capable of growing multiple heads from its decapitated stalks. Many forget he was ever even human. Those in control at Deboth Kra claim that they kept him around simply for the glee of making an example out of him, and while that may be true in part, it's equally true that they feared both him and what he represented. That's why Lavos was personally assigned to his care. Now, Lavos, ever the professional, managed many prisoners to himself, as was his sole purpose. He carried his Cedo in hand, delivering death strikes with the butt of his shotgun to those in his charge. He was known for being especially sadistic as far as the Orokin went, although this was likely just his programming, doing as commanded by his gilded masters. However, his beatings of Jarvi were so frequent, cruel and torturous that even his Orokin colleagues winced in pain, cringing at the screams of agony that Jarvi let out whenever Lavos visited him alone. The Warframe donned his Vitam Dana with pride as he set to following the commands of his superiors, spending countless hours alone with Jarvi long into the night, and then the morning, beating him until every breath burned his body on the cusp of fatality. Quite ironic for the one carrying the Vitam, the meaning of which literally means of life. Life was frankly a punishment for Jarvi, not allowing his suffering to merely end. A floor washer employed by the Orokin named Bekran Zaf took keen interest in Lavos and even testified that Lavos took such keen interest in Jarvi that his torture of other inmates took a backseat to the personal attention that Jarvi personally received. The floor cleaner recalled seeing Jarvi in pools of his own blood and excrement, lying there, struggling to even open an eyelid after Lavos had paid him his dues. However, they did notice something else. Jarvi had been doing something quite peculiar here at Deboth Kra. He was using his bodily fluids like ink, painting the walls of his cells in what Bekran dismissed as heretical ravings and the ramblings of a madman. One thing stood out though, a full portrait of Lavos, complete with his chakram-launching shotgun and Vitam Dana. Even to the illiterate, this drawing was immediately obvious. What had not occurred to anyone in the facility was that Lavos had a keen interest in learning, for he was a Warframe with no powers, not an inkling of specialty to call his own. Had someone with an eye for the esoteric or occult, such as Drusus Leverian, checked the walls of Jarvi's cell, they would not see insane ramblings or scribbles, but rather star charts, DNA sequencing, snakes representing the gods of transmutation, endless chains of elements and combinations thereof. It would recontextualize that Lavos was not simply giving Jarvi beatings, he was receiving sermons on transmutation, absorbing every detail of the secrets that could help him command the mundane. It was as if, rather than the predator and prey, prisoner and warden relationship, Lavos and Jarvi had something much more complicated, similar to a mentor and his student. After a long time, the Orokin masters had enough of torturing Jarvi, attempting to break his will. They decided that they would brave the execution. However, instead of merely throwing him into the Jade Light and hoping to be done with him, they concocted something they considered much more final, much more fatal: cellular reversal. Even a master of transmutation would not return from being turned into a pile of mere genetic mass, DNA, liquids, and memories. It was a cruel, ironic end, and as such was a popular idea among the Orokin bureaucracy. They would transmute Jarvi into molecular nonsense, using his life's work against him, and they'd get Lavos to do it. On the day of execution, Lavos donned his new helmet, a new token of station, the Lavos Caudatus headpiece. But with this helmet came new power, the powers of cellular matter itself. Lavos was to be the method of execution for Jarvi. Lavos personally dressed Jarvi anew for the day, a new robe and hood befitting of the former Archimedean, clean and white. Lavos then led Jarvi to the executioner dais, with a slow, solemn, silent stroll. Prisoners watching from the cells, Orokin jailers and royalty all sat together in their seats as if watching a stage play or listening to a bardic poem. Even now they couldn't help but indulge in the occasion, finding an excuse for crude revelry. The order was given, and just before Lavos lifted his arms to activate his powers, Jarvi whispered one final rite to the astute, attentive Warframe. And then in a flash he was turned into a pool of writhing matter. For the Orokin Masters, the job was done and Jarvi was finally out of their hair. They began to celebrate. However, for Lavos, his work had just begun. He began utilizing the countless hours of his studies on transmutation, working it through the new powers his Orokin Masters had rewarded him, and it was noticed all too late that Lavos was transmuting Jarvi's remains into something anew. A snake circling around his wrist, not as a tattoo but as a very real appendage made from bioferrous tissue that held Jarvi's very own cognizance. Then a second snake emerged from Lavos' other wrist, a symbol of change that Jarvi had delivered unto him. His teacher had transmuted Lavos himself from a mere jailer to an executioner of justice. The Orokin Masters looked up to witness the display before them. The laughing and clinking of glasses stopped, with shock and awe before Lavos grasped his Cedo once more. He launched himself towards the Orokin Masters by streams of supercooled water and shards of ice. His Cedo shot out a razor-sharp chakram that bounced from wall to wall, tearing them apart in a flash. In one final act of defiance, Lavos completed his imperfect design by transmuting the decadent gilding from every surface in Deboath Kra, adorning himself in shining, golden excellence, a Warframe primed. In this moment, he had earned it far more than his cruel captors ever had. It's still unknown if a real primed Lavos ever existed, but this has become irrelevant. The Lavos that absorbed Jarvi became his own prime that day. It's highly likely that because Lavos was never meant to receive abilities, he was never granted a source of storing energy like other Warframes. His power stemmed from the tanks of biofluids that covered his body. Instead of draining resources of the almost magical, he instead simply waited for his body to naturally produce the source of his transmutational brilliance from the air. In his disappearance, Deboath Kra was condemned, the slaughter of the Orokin Masters embarrassing their empire. Records were burned, the prison became little more than ruins in the Venusian mountains. If it weren't for Lavos taking pity on that poor floor washer Bekran Zaft, this tale would be lost to time forever.